Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Deborah Omowale Jarman, the Executive Director of the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. We are so excited to have an awesome panel discussion planned for you this morning, and we want to get right to it. So I will introduce our moderator, Cory Mobley. Elder Cory Mobley, Sr. of San Antonio, Texas, was born and raised by Benny and Edna Mobley of Lancaster, South Carolina. He has two sisters, Ms. Karen Mobley and Ms. Tracy Chavez. He is married to the very gorgeous Veronica Wright Mobley, and they have 4 children, 3 grandchildren, and a host of foster and godchildren. Elder Mobley, who is affectionately known as Brother Cory, is spiritually fed at True Vision Church in San Antonio, Texas, where the senior pastor is Pastor Michael Steve Brown since 2002. There he serves as the youth minister and the assistant to the senior pastor. Good morning, Elder Mobley.
Hello. It says the host has my video off.
Yes, that is a true statement because your video was off until after the introductions.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
And actually, no, that's okay. Mine should be off too, but it's
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Hello, my name is Cory Mobley. I would like to introduce
start again. Okay,
Okay.
there you go.
All right. Hello, my name is Cory Mobley from True Vision Church, as it was already told. I'm excited to be here. Glad to be the moderator today. Anxious to get to know our panelists even better, but let me introduce each one of them. Our first panelist is Mr. Brandon Johnson. Brandon's work in voter registration started in 2015 and has continued every year since then. He has worked on numerous political campaigns and served as a constituent liaison for a San Antonio City Council member. He graduated with degrees from the University of Texas at San Antonio in public administration and criminal justice in 2019. Brandon is currently a community organizer in the city of San Antonio and the vicinity, and the regional organizing manager for Move Texas. Dr. Katherine Kuehler-Walters, our next panelist. Dr. Katherine Kuehler-Walters is the assistant editor at the Handbook of Texas. And she received her PhD in history from Texas A&M University in 2018. She researches race and gender history between the 1880s and 1930s and specializes in the history of civil rights activism, voting rights, the Ku Klux Klan, and structural racism in Texas and the New South. She has taught history courses at various Texas universities and provided research to several publications, including co-authoring a piece with Kyle G. Wilkinson in Impeached, the removal of Texas Governor James E. Ferguson, its centennial examination. In 2017, she was especially honored to present her research on African-American civil rights activist and attorney Richard D. Evans, the first president of the Texas State Conference of Branches of the NAACP at the organization's 80th annual meeting. During COVID, she has had the pleasure of volunteering for SAAACAM and hopes to continue in the future. Panelists, thank you so much for being here today. Looking forward to a amazing and impactful conversation as it relates to voting. We have a few questions that have been sent to us for discussion, and so I'm ready to kick this off. I just want to note that voting is so important. We say that all the time, but just the impact that voting for one particular office versus another particular office and the ripple effect that these elections have between offices is not just a vote for one person in one position, It's a vote for a person that has the ability to influence other positions. So this is such an important topic. It's very broad, so we're going to try our best through the use of these particular questions, these specific questions, to have a well-rounded discussion as it relates to voting. So thank you again for being here, and I'm looking forward to hearing your responses to these questions. Let's start off by talking about the significance of voting, and Dr. Katherine, we'll start with you. And this question is, please describe some of the tactics used during elections to prevent African Americans from voting after Reconstruction.
After Reconstruction, there were numerous ways to suppress and the vote and disfranchise voters, particularly on the local level, but also on the state level and the county level. And the reason they could do this was because the 15th Amendment had been narrowed and essentially hollowed out by a series of court decisions by the Supreme Court in the 1870s, which allowed for disfranchisement on by private citizens as opposed to a state. Once they made those decisions, certain ways to suppress the vote came locally, often in ways that had been done before. And mostly it would be things like, hold on, don't know why my phone is talking. So the way they would do that on the local level is they would coerce votes, they would bribe voters, there was violence and intimidation. Employers would try to force their employees to vote a certain way, and landowners would try to pressure their tenant farmers to vote a certain way. There was also stuffed ballot boxes and lost ballot boxes. And so that is some of the ways they did it locally in a more extra legal, non-legal sort of way. Legally, they did it in many other ways, and that would include things like districting in a certain way that would isolate Black voters into a certain area, like in a ward or a certain congressional district, or like in Galveston in 1900, they got rid of ward voting and they decided to vote for candidates at large, which diluted the Black vote in Galveston. So there was a lot of different ways to do it. There still are a lot of different ways to do it. And pretty much most of them have been tried. So they keep working on that. They also did a poll tax in 1903. The poll tax was a certain amount that everyone had to pay to vote. They had to pay it in January, and the elections weren't until March or May or July or November. And a lot of people would forget to pay that poll tax, or they didn't have the money to pay the poll tax, especially if they were farmers, because they had run out of money by then. It was right after Christmas. It was long after the harvest. So in many ways, the poll tax was timed in a way to disfranchise quite a few people, particularly African Americans, particularly working poor. And they also had a secret ballot. They started the secret ballot in 1890s. That was a de facto literacy clause because the first provisions that were included, which were changed later, said that you could not help somebody read their ballot. And if you couldn't help somebody read their ballot, they had to read it themselves, which in effect disfranchised anyone who could not read. And that included a large number of rural people, a large number of people who did not have access to education, whether by distance or because they had to work and they couldn't go to school. In 1905, they passed the primary law. The primary law, the poll tax, and the secret ballot were all considered progressive laws, and they were to help more people have a voice in politics, as opposed to the rich head of the political parties that were in the state as well as country deciding it in a back room. So that's why they considered these progressives. But in the South, they took them and they twisted them to fit into a voting structure that would disfranchise the groups that would vote against the dominant party in the South. And the dominant party in the South was the Democratic Party at that time. The Democratic Party was the self-professed party of white supremacy at the time. To be clear, because it's been used in political campaigns as of late, the Democratic Party of the 1890s and of the 1850s and 60s eventually become disenchanted with the Democratic Party nationally during FDR in the 1930s and the New Deal, and eventually start moving away from the Democratic Party. They first create the Dixiecrat Party, and they vote that direction. Strom Thurmond was their first presidential candidate, and then slowly and gradually, they shift over to the Republican Party. The Republican Party in the 1930s was disenchanted with the Democrats, but they were also disenchanted with their own Republican Party, and over time, they flip as well. And what ends up happening is the parties change ideologies, or the people change party names. So African Americans were largely voting Republican in the 1890s, 1870s. By the time we get to the 1960s, most African Americans are voting Democrat because of the switch, because we move from FDR to the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act. So just so that no one gets those confused, the Democratic Party of that time is not the Democratic Party of this time. But those are many of the ways that they would disfranchise large groups of people in certain areas. And it was usually directed to race and class, particularly race.
Would you do us a favor, Doctor? Would you expand a little bit more, particularly in San Antonio? I know you were talking local, but
yes,
become even more specific, San Antonio-wise. What were they do? What were the tactics?
Well, the typical tactics followed most of them early on. So local African Americans had poll watchers, even in the 1870s. Many African Americans, those are the only people who could vote, were men. African American men joined the Union League, also called the Loyal League, and they would watch polls. They would become election judges. San Antonio was a little unique in the state in the fact that it was more Republican at that time than Democrat. And they actually could gain a voice. They would also have meetings to inform people on how to fill out a ballot. And this was another way to disfranchise, because the way you properly filled out a ballot changed from election to election. It still does. Ballots as well as elections are overseen by local officials, and elections are a state power. And because of that, the way you vote differs in different precincts, different counties, different states, which is why we have a lot of conversations now about ballots and how, whether we have electronic machines or not. But this was the case then. And so at the time you could scratch out all the names that you didn't want, and that would be the one you wanted, or you could put an X by the name you wanted, but it really had to follow the directions. And if it didn't, that ballot was thrown out. And so that was one way. If the voters were not informed on how to fill out that particular ballot, it could undermine their voice, their political voice. So that was one way it was done there. Other ways it was done was, we mentioned the poll taxes. You had to have your receipt when you went to the polls to show that you paid your poll tax. And often these would get lost, often they would be misplaced. And so locals like Charles Bellinger and various other local businessmen would hold on to the poll tax receipts for people. And then on election day, could, you know, distribute them and for the voters to go to the polling place. One particular interesting thing about San Antonio, at least for me, is that the white primary, the primary law, the way it fit in the South, was Thurgood Marshall calls it the most effective disfranchisement device in U.S. history. And in Texas, they the first law that was passed in 1905 did not explicitly exclude whites from voting in the Democratic primary. It was assumed, and control was given to the local officials to decide who could vote. And in most counties, they excluded anyone who was African American. In San Antonio, they did not. And I'm sure this is the case in some certain other cities that were more South Texas or West Texas, but they did not. And different counties picked it up at different times. A lot of them started in 1905, but like DeWitt County started in 1914. And here in San Antonio, they had nonpartisan local elections. And so African Americans had quite a strong voice here locally in San Antonio. And it's interesting because the big push against the white primary happens after 1922, when the former district attorney from San Antonio, his name is D.A. McCaskill, goes to the state legislature and asks them and pushes them to make the primary law explicit about race and explicitly disfranchise African Americans from what had become the only election that really had any power. Because whoever won the Democratic primary in the state usually won the state elections and most county elections. In San Antonio, it was different. Republicans were much stronger here, but elsewhere, that wasn't the case. And he had lost, he said, because political machines, because African Americans were allowed to vote. And so he pushed for that change. When they made that change, and it came into effect in 1923, the NAACP had an opportunity to take them to court, to take the state to court, to take county officials to court, because it explicitly disfranchised by race, which violated the 15th and the 14th Amendments. And because of that, there's this long history, a series of court cases from 1920s. Well, the first one that is the big winner is 1927, Nixon versus Condon from El Paso. And all the way till Smith versus Allwright, 1944. And one of those cases in between there was pushed by a man named Cameron Booker from San Antonio. And he pushed to overturn the white primary here locally. So a lot of these kind of fights were going on at the local level in San Antonio, and the NAACP and various other groups, Black churches, Black businessmen and women were very much involved in that.
Wow. It's a lot, huh? The continuing in this vein, a specific question for you, Mr. Demonte and Mr. Brandon, is this: what does voter suppression look like in 2020, nationally, statewide, and then specifically San Antonio? And then how is it being addressed? I mean, when we hear the history of it, let's fast forward to 2020. What does that voter suppression look like even now? And then how is it? I mean, how is it being addressed? Mr. Brandon, if you would respond first, please.
So similarly, like how we had it back in the day and now, we have overt and we have covert ways of voter suppression. Some overt ways would be closing polling sites and continuing to make laws that make it harder for people to vote. Some more covert ways would be laws that make it harder for others to become deputy voter registrars. And the hardest one is other people like us saying voting doesn't matter, voting doesn't count. And that's voter suppression that all of us can be guilty of if we're not careful. So when we talk about closing polling sites, we often see that the first polling sites to be closed are in low income and majority Black neighborhoods. And of course, where large populations of youth are. In San Antonio, we've seen that with Bexar County attempting to close UTSA, and that's been a polling site for over 5 years. So Move Texas has fought to keep UTSA as an early voting polling site and for Election Day. And a big one here in Texas specifically is laws that make it harder for people to vote. And that looks like voter suppression when you're able to walk in with a handgun license as a valid form of identification to go vote, but a college student can't take their state-issued college ID to go vote. And you can make an argument that generally people who vote one way own a handgun license and people who vote another way have a college ID.
Yeah.
So that's another form of voter suppression. Here locally, again, we had many young people want to be involved and start making change on a local level. So they decided to take the test and become a deputy voter registrar and register their friends, their family and community to go vote. And after only a month of that, we've seen the Bexar County Elections Department say that we had too many deputy voter registrars, and they were going to start stripping people away of their status. I've never heard of having too much of a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Wanting other people to be involved and fighting for that. And of course, we have the last form of voter suppression, which all of us can do a part to help fight against, and that's the common misnotion of hearing that your vote doesn't count. It's not worth it to go out and vote. Because I've never seen a politician in power tell their people that their vote doesn't count. So it's up to us whenever we hear that to counter that. There's a reason why we have systems in place that make it harder to vote instead of easier to vote. Those who are in power would like to stay in power, and that's easily done when less people vote and vote informed. So MOVE is again adapting to all of this, providing voter information on candidates, who's running, and explaining to young people and all people that their vote absolutely matters, and we need them to come out and vote in the polls, not just in the presidential election, but all up and down the ballot, all the way down to local elections.
So even that, I guess when you look at the voter suppression, is they keep it spread out so that once you get a grab on this particular concept that's being used, that's when you were talking about, Dr. Katherine, they changed the rules and now it gets adapted to the, well, let's so that transitions us then as we talk about elections. So the local election participation, we've seen how they've tried to stop participation with suppression and tactics. Can we, Dr. Katherine, if you could answer this question, looking at historically, did African Americans in San Antonio have a voice in local elections? We see how they suppressed us, and we hear how the changing of the guard each time someone would rise to power to push it back down. Was there ever a time historically that African Americans in San Antonio had a voice in these local elections?
Yes, they had a strong voice going back until since the 15th Amendment. And in San Antonio, there were numerous leaders, local leaders that were businessmen. They were in the military. San Antonio, one of the reasons San Antonio had such a strong Black political community was because the military was in the city, and that provided some protection because the federal government was there. The federal government had been, during Reconstruction, the watchdogs of rights for the formerly enslaved. And soldiers were here and they decided to stay and live here. There's numerous records of various individuals who become business leaders who have this military background. They moved to the city because they had belonged to, they were in the U.S. Army. So that is one way that it happened. There were a lot of local leaders, teachers. Nace Duval comes to mind. Mitchell Body comes to mind. Ralph Booker comes to mind. Anderson Booker, who was, I forget, the grandfather of Cameron Booker, who I had mentioned earlier. He was very politically active in the 1870s and 1880s. And they're the ones that were part of the Union League. They were there for, and it was a big deal. To go to the polls was a really big deal. It was a patriotic duty. It was a right. It was a thing that was equivalent to education because it meant citizenship. And this tradition continued on in San Antonio because the political parties were more balanced here. It was a real contest here. And there was a coalition vote over the Democrats in this area. And because of that, African Americans really had an opportunity to see results from their vote, which, to keep people voting, that's the best way to do it, is if you vote and you get your guy in office, you get the things that you need to get: better streets, better schools, flood control, that sort of thing. And the African American community had a man named Grumbles. They've had a man named Tarver, and I mentioned Bellinger. It was Charles Bellinger and his son Valmo who kind of carried it on after Charles died. The Sutton family, I believe Sutton was the first congressman, a Black congressman from the city to be elected to Congress. And Claude Black, I mean, the names go on and on. And so because the leadership had a relationship with local government officials, and because they were a constituency that was part of this coalition that was effective to get their man in office, because of that, they could get things for their vote. And it wasn't so much a quid pro quo or anything. I'm not trying to suggest that. What I'm saying is that when you vote your guy in, the guy knows he needs to keep your vote. To keep your vote, he needs to respond to the needs of the community. And more often than not, that this is what's happened. Now, I'm not saying in any way that San Antonio is, uh-oh. I don't know what that was. Okay, so I'm not saying in any way that San Antonio was not racist. It didn't have disfranchisement, it didn't have segregation, it did. But in comparison to the rest of the state, they had a strong political vote, and it was known in the state as a quality place to live for African Americans, as opposed to some of the rural areas further East Texas, where the vote had been suppressed effectively since the 1870s. So yes, they did. They had a very strong political voice, and they had been involved in politics for a long time in the city. As a community, I should say.
Yes. So now speaking locally then, Mr. Brandon, with the same vein, let's talk about MOVE. Could you explain the mission of MOVE Texas, with your organization that you're affiliated with, and why participation in local elections is so important? Why is it so important?
Well, MOVE stands for Mobilize, Organize, Vote, and Empower. And I like to say there's an extra E, and that extra E stands for Educate. So we do just that. Our main goal is to create a power structure for young people to, one, get registered to vote, as many young people as registered to vote as possible, and two, make sure that we turn them out to vote, make sure that we become a force of engaged young people who know the issues and turn out to vote. And that's where the mobilize and organizing comes in. We educate young people, like I talked about earlier with voter guides. We want to make sure that they understand who's on the ballot, their platforms, what they believe in, and almost just as importantly, what the position does. For example, the position of governor or secretary of state, all the way down to sheriff. We want to make sure that people understand what they can do in those roles, how that position affects them, and if you need something looked at or taken care of, who you can call to tackle that issue. And what's at stake in this election is so many things, but something that an older gentleman told me 5 years ago at the Martin Luther King March. He said that our ancestors could not vote their way out of slavery. However, if we don't vote, we are at risk of being put back into slavery. And that's very true. It always stuck with me. And slavery doesn't necessarily have to be, in change. It can be economic slavery, educational slavery, oppression, voting rights. So those are some of the things that are at stake if we don't vote in this election. And we just want to re-emphasize that we need to vote all the way down ballot because, when it comes down to having our sidewalks fixed, getting our schools funded, that's here locally. The clean drinking water, that starts locally, and it starts with us making our voice heard.
That is so true. I've mentioned this before, and I'll say it again now. I didn't grow up in Texas. I grew up in South Carolina, and a lot of the positions that are voted on politically here were people that were hired in South Carolina, and in some aspects. And so when you say vote all the way down, two things come to mind. Number one, knowing what those positions are, and then also, like you said, going all the way down the ballot, because we're not just, we make the presidential side of the election. There's over 50 different positions that we're voting for on November the 3rd alone. So we do have to vote all the way down and educate ourselves on the ballot. I know we can go to, there's a website that we can go to called votetexas.org that provides plenty of information as it relates to what is on the ballot for the upcoming election. Precincts, where to go, what spot is closest to you, put in your zip code, it'll give you the closest location for voting, locations to vote, hours of operation, phone numbers to call if you need. So I think we do have to educate ourselves in these local elections. You all spoke of youth, or at least the young adults, the college kids being part of elections earlier. And so this question is for definitely all the panelists. Dr. Katherine, we'll start with you. How have youth groups and student organizations or student or university organizations engaged in the voting, especially in the process here in San Antonio? And we keep looking at locally because we're trying to be so specific and relating this particular discussion to our local constituents. But how have youth groups, youth organizations, student organizations engaged in the voting in the process here in San Antonio, Texas?
Well, to kind of to give you context of it, youth groups, NAACP youth groups were very much involved in the city in many aspects of the civil rights movement. Okay. Throughout, when I say civil rights movement, I mean the long civil rights movement. I'm not talking about just in the 50s and the 60s. They were very much a part of trying to integrate schools and integrate public places. To understand this, voting rights didn't happen in a bubble. And so I bring this up because voting goes hand in hand with civil rights. You can't fix the problems in your society, in your schools, on your streets, unless you vote, because unless you have a voice and they have to get your vote to win. Unless you vote, then they don't have to pay attention. And if they don't have to pay attention, then they don't have to fix anything. And so getting voting rights went hand in hand with all of these other issues. And youth groups in San Antonio were very much involved in many aspects of the civil rights movement. One in particular that SAAACAM has been very much involved with is preserving the Woolworths building that had the Woolworths counter that was integrated by, her name was Lillian, and I believe she was in the Sutton family. That was the first lunch counter in a major southern city to integrate. And most people don't realize that. Even my friends who are historians did not know that. I did not know that until I moved to San Antonio. And that's a big part of a story of activism that goes with voting. Other youth groups and student groups, especially at HBCUs, obviously we had St. Philip's College here, but there were numerous ones, Texas Southern and Prairie View. They had always traditionally been groups that pushed for voting rights in their area. They pushed for, Prairie View comes to mind in particular because Prairie View's fight in Waller County was a particular battle that has been ongoing, and they've had to stay very vigilant to keep a polling place near their campus or on their campus because there's not many people who live in Waller County, and Prairie View is not exactly in town. It's across the highway. It's kind of separated, and they don't have a public transportation system. So a lot of the things that we're used to in San Antonio to get to a polling place, they don't have as students. And they've had to be very active to keep a polling place, but to get a polling place, they've gone to court many, many times. And Waller has been very steadfast and very vigilant to prevent as much as possible those students voting, because they're really worried about what those voters would have to say. Texas Southern is the same. They've been very active as well. And I know many students here at universities. Brandon mentioned UTSA, but this tradition goes way back. So it's a constant, vigilance is always important.
Wow. Hey, Mr. Brandon?
Absolutely. Like the doctor said, we've seen college campuses throughout San Antonio, UTSA, St. Philip's particularly, the Alamo colleges, they all have been particularly focused on pushing voting and voting information to their students there. But something beautiful I seen in early June was in the wake of the George Floyd uprising that we've seen. In the wake of all those protests we've seen here in San Antonio, many of those young people got together and said, we want to make change in this community. So they've decided to become deputy voter registrars on their own accord. So they would get all the tools and information they need. And at this point, it was actually necessary. And I say that because of COVID, many of the college campuses who usually would have in-person voting events and registering people to vote are no longer having those. So it's now up to these young people who are doing this on their own accord to go out and register their own friends, their own family.
Yeah.
It starts with us. We have to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable, and our friends and our family members who may be on the ropes about voting. We have to encourage them. And I'm so heartened to see those young people go and take up the torch on their own.
Let me add this question in there. I'm a youth minister, so I feel myself as a youth advocate. So this question is school elections. I can remember coming up and you would have a mock election in your school. And do those help? Having these mock elections, having someone pretend to be candidates, stand out there in front of us in the middle of the gymnasium, in the middle of the auditorium, and pretend to be the Democratic candidate for president, pretend to be the Republican, and do it all week long leading up to the election. Does that help? Have y'all seen that help, or is that kind of a makes it into a funnier thing? What was your response to that particular question?
If those schools find a way to make that process complicated and include electoral college, that would be great.
Okay.
The complexity of electoral college. But in general, just having that process just the way it is now absolutely helps. It normalizes the way we think about voting. Even when I was coming up in the school system, we would hold those mock elections, and the teachers stressed the importance of voting and having their voice and their vote count. So if we continue to normalize this and continue to make this just a normal thing, hey, I should vote as a productive citizen, I should vote. It's my duty to vote. As long as we continue to normalize this, that absolutely helps. So we no longer have generations of young people who, when they leave school, have that mindset that voting doesn't count, and they're not going to be involved, and then they continue that and pass that on to the next generation. So I encourage to continue to have those.
And our historian, Dr. Catherine, what do you think?
I think it helps quite a bit in raising awareness of how the process works. I think it's important to understand choice. I think it's also important to understand that arguments are complicated, and when, and I think this is very important just here lately, but it's always been important in elections to be able to suss out what somebody is saying and if they can actually do what they're saying. I hear promises quite a bit, and to me, often they sound like a detergent commercial, or you name it, because sometimes it's just too good to be true, and we have to understand that those are advertisements. We have to understand that that's essentially, for the lack of a better word, propaganda to sell somebody to you. And we have to be very critical, and we have to understand the process, and we have to understand, as you said earlier, what their role is in government, what their power is in government, what they can do, to understand that one branch has the money, the purse of government, and another branch is the branch that gets to interpret the laws. And we need to understand all that, and elections is a critical part of the whole system. And so are voters, so is media, but we have to be savvy and we have to be critical. And that's kind of a good way to kind of get them started in that whole idea and the process to think about these things. Because to create the mock part is you have to think in those terms. And so it kind of changes it in a way, a perspective that, makes you think about it in a different way than you did before. And so I think it's very important to do.
Dr. Catherine made a great point, is that, the people who hold many of the power that we look for to make the change are people in Congress or our state house. So I think if we can hold mock elections for our congressmen and our state officials, that'll be the key.
Yeah, makes sense. That all makes sense. You all spoke, you mentioned the Electoral College, and so this leads me to ask this question as we talk about the finances behind these elections. Because I think sometimes some votes, well, let me not start on my propaganda. Let me stick to the script. The question is, how does wealth influence the election process? Speaking of finances, how does this is for all of our panelists? How does wealth influence the election process?
Well, I'll talk about in the past. Wealth has always played a major role. At one time in this country, only the wealthy could vote. At one time in this country, you had to own land to vote. Slowly, voting rights has been democratized over time, and to the point where, we do worry about poll taxes, and we do worry about these sorts of things through voter ID laws. If you have to pay for a voter ID, if you have to pay for an ID, then it essentially becomes a poll tax, and we have to worry about those things. But the wealthy, traditionally, because they could fund certain candidates or they could donate a lot of money, their voice tended and tends to now be heard over the masses. And it takes a larger number of people to equalize the wealthier's voice, because they you know, they belong to certain groups, certain social clubs, they go to the same golf courses, you know, those sorts of things. And they have that private one-on-one with politicians of every level. It's local level, it's school boards, it's all the way to the White House. And so if you can have one-on-ones, that right there means your voice is heard more than the average person. But also the wealthy can fund organizations that often frame what the issues are talked about, which issues are talked about, and how they're talked about. So if the wealthy are concerned with preserving a certain area of San Antonio to make sure trees aren't chopped down, which I remember was an issue like 2 years ago, that there was a big hoopla because it was north of 1604, as opposed to flood control, because there's certain neighborhoods in this city that every time it floods, people hold their breath because, you know, the streets are going to flood, which is an old problem that should have been probably fixed a long time ago. But which story is the media going to talk about? Which story is the politicians are going to talk about? And the wealthy vote. They vote with not only their ballot, but they also vote with their wallet. And if they can fund campaigns, if they can fund commercials, they often get to frame the dialogue of debates, and they get to help choose the issues that are discussed. And it takes a lot of people to drown out that money.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Please, Mr. Brandon.
Yes, the key locally to defeating, you know, people with money is voting in mass. You know, for the past 100 years nationally, America has voted less in a 60% turnout, and even locally, it's even less than that. In local elections, it can be as high as about 15% in San Antonio, and that can be considered good. That can be a good election cycle. So, you know, the people who have money, they're almost essentially buying the election because we're not voting in mass. You know, people with money know they can target specific groups of people, and those small specific group of people affect the outcome of the election. But if we all vote in mass and consistently vote in mass, the elected officials or politicians, they're going to have to come to the people and earn their vote versus just buying the vote for special interests for a select group of people.
And this is actually something that has happened in San Antonio. When Charles Bellinger was in San Antonio, he died in 1937, and he would hold on to those poll taxes. He was a very wealthy man. He had a lot of business interest, and he had the ear of politicians, but he could deliver the vote. And if he could not deliver the vote, they wouldn't have listened to him.
Yeah,
they wouldn't have talked to him. And because the voters did come out en masse, they had better streets than certain the southern parts, the barrios of the southern parts of the city. They had more attention about schools. And because they had a political, because the people they voted them that voted them in had an interest in keeping their vote. And that's kind of the critical element. And Bellinger knew that. So if you want to keep the vote, then you better give us something for our vote. We need city services. We need better schools. We expect the city, if you want to keep it, you need to make sure you provide for what you're supposed to provide of the constituents.
Wow. In all of this, when we round out this discussion, I mean, we've talked about the finances, we've talked about youth and voting, we've talked about how it operates, suppression, a lot of different subjects. When take all of that in and form a response to this particular question, what is at risk when people don't vote? What would be your response to that, Dr. Katherine?
I would point to Flint. They still don't have clean water.
Mm.
I would point to parts of San Antonio that may not get the vote out. They may not organize. And it does take that kind of effort. It's almost Herculean, it feels like at times, but flood control, it takes, there's so many different things because there's so many different elections. School board elections are essential, and I don't think people take them as seriously as they really should. But it's also elections at the state level for not just governor or lieutenant governor, but also for railroad commissioner, the ag commissioner, the Department of Education. These officials of these departments, the decisions that they make affect our daily lives and will affect our daily lives for a long time. And it's property taxes, and it's city services. It's so many different things. The mask ordinance just here lately. You know, everybody has a political opinion. That's one thing I've learned over the last 5 years in this state, you know, and because of that, everybody needs to speak up and voice their opinion at the ballot box to make real change if they want it. But they have to understand that the system sometimes is geared to make things hard, and without voting, that's just basically letting them win. They're basically giving away their voice willingly. Redistricting is very important right now. Filling out your census is very important right now. I want to make sure I mention that, because from the census, we find out who is living where in the state, in the country, and representation is based on the census record. So if you don't fill out your census, you're basically giving up part of that voice. You're giving up some of the tax dollars that come with it. So suppression of the census, discouraging people to fill out the census, trying to scare people not to fill out the census, that's part of voter suppression, because they're going to redistrict just like they did 10 years ago. And gerrymandering is a big, big hurdle in this particular state, as well as other states. Lines are drawn in a way that will drown out certain voting voices, and the state is a part of that. So if we want a fair district, we need to fill out our census records, and we need to vote to make sure that they pay attention.
Mr. Brandon.
What's at stake if we don't vote is the future that we would like to see in our communities, in our city. Voting is like a seed, you know, you plant it, you nurture it, and eventually the outcome of that vote can result in the fruit, better sidewalks, you know, clean drinking water. And not voting is neglecting that seed and just watching it wither away and die. And what I mean by that, you know, every one of these positions and every one of these votes means something. It affects either you personally, someone you know, your family member. So, for example, if you have a speeding ticket and you go before a judge who is tough on crime, and we know what tough on crime means in the history of this country, and that judge had only won that seat by a matter of 2 or 3 votes. So now you're coming before a judge who's tough on crime, is going to put you away in jail. Possibly you could lose your job because of this, because he was elected by 3 votes, versus coming before a judge who's compassionate, understands that, you know, everybody who comes before the court is not a criminal, and understands restorative justice. So it's 2 total different sides of the system. And what determines that is how you vote and getting other people to vote. So again, the future that you would like to see in yourself, community, your jobs, education, all comes down to voting.
There is so much wrapped up into this subject that we could spend. I mean, this has just been a 1-hour discussion, and I know you all just hit the cusp or the top layer of what each one of these topics could dive into. And I thank you all very much for allowing me to at least throw these particular questions at you as your moderator. And I really appreciate just the level of things I've learned today, this morning, by you all just sharing with us. I really appreciate the jobs you all are doing, the history that you're collecting, and the move that you're making with Texas Move in your organizations. That's phenomenal work. Mr. Demonte in his own right, and what he does with just the research and the data he collects. So thank you all again. I'm going to turn it back over to our SAAACAM host, and we look forward to seeing you all work some more in our community. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for having us.